Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'a sunnatahu ila yawmiddin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome again to another episode of your weekly Islamic chat show, Guest of the Week, coming to you from Sharjah TV. As always, I'm your host, Ismail Bullock. And today, inshallah, continuing in our Ramadan episodes, we want to focus more about, and we touched upon it, but we're going to tackle it from a different angle. The whole concept of habits, good and bad, and how we can connect this to Ramadan. And to that with me is Ustad Muawiyah Taka. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, sir. Thanks for having me here again.
Yeah, I was going to say, nice to have you back again. So one of our previous episodes, we touched briefly on, the fact habits and good habits and bad habits, but obviously we're going to look at it from some different angles now because, Ramadan is a time, in theory, where you should pick up good habits and you should stop bad habits if you're doing it right.
Yeah. I mean, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa ala Rasulihi al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. So, Ramadan is a, take a step back. Because Ramadan is one of the acts of Ibadah in Islam. Just one of them. There are many acts of Ibadah. And if you look at Islam as a whole, we often say as Muslims that Islam is a way of life. And sometimes we say these things and we don't actually fully grasp how far this statement goes. It goes very far. Yes, it's a way of life. Yes, it's a legal system. Yes. But it goes so much more deeper than that. I would say that Islam is literally the functioning manual of the human body itself, the actual human physical body. And that's why you find so many people when they come to Islam, even myself when I came to Islam, you find that it fits so well with so many things of our human being, our nature, in terms of our desires, in terms of our needs and wants, what this body actually wants on a psychological level, on a physical level, what a society needs culturally, the family and the relationship within the family. Islam literally fits everything perfectly. And one of those ways in which it does so is by being in line with the fitrah, the natural disposition, how the body functions. And that is building habits. So it's not just Ramadan itself. Ramadan is a perfect example. We're going to touch upon the actual connection between Ramadan and its function as in terms of building habits. But all acts of worship are repetitive, small, there to build better character, to make you innately good. And when I say innately good, I don't mean good because you chose to be good because you just are good. You've become a specimen of goodness. But how do you do so? Through habits, the habitual process of being a human being. So back to the issue of Ramadan. So as we know the rules of Ramadan. You fast from the sunrise, you break your fast at sunset, you do all these things we do on a daily basis. We're encouraged to do more good deeds than we usually would do. Small ones, for example, being charitable, opening a door for the general public if they need to, helping people out. These are things we're encouraged to do anyway as part of Muslims, as part of Islam. But I wanted to just open up to the audience. What is it about the human mind that allows us to be this way? And this is the issue of habits. So, in the 19th century or 20th century, I should say, there were a few breakthroughs in the science of psychology that opened up or taught us as human beings how the mind works. That if you look at it, you can almost say that subhanAllah, Islam already knew this. If you look at how Islam has functioned, you see that Islam already knew this, even though it never said it specifically. So there was a few individuals historically that they built their case from. One of them was a person named Eugene, is not his real name. They were obviously kept private for privacy reasons, but they named him in the books of psychology. His name was Eugene. And what was unique about Eugene is that he had an infection in the brain. I'm not sure if it was fungal or bacterial, but the point was it damaged a part of the brain which dealt with building long-term memory.
Okay.
Now, if you think about that, that's horrific. I mean, what does that mean? If you imagine someone telling you, I'm sorry, sir, but from now on, anything beyond 10 minutes, you're going to forget about it. And that's literally how he lived the rest of his life. He was unable to shift what was in his short-term working memory into anything long-term. So up until he got the infection, all those memories of his life he had in his mind because they're already being built in his brain. But from that moment on, nothing else. So as far as he was concerned, he was always the same age of when he got first infected, which is, subhanAllah, it's a musibah, it's a tragedy. And these are one of the many, many blessings from Allah we just overlook, we're not even aware of. So, okay, so that's the first part of the situation. He was now living with this, you could say, disability. He's unable to form short to long-term memories. And what's even amazing about that disease specifically, so if you think about it, he's unaware of that disease. He's unable to be aware of that disease. I mean, if you told him this is his condition, he'd be like, oh, that's so bad. But after 10 minutes, he's unaware of it again. He was even unaware that he was unaware. That would be probably the best example of jahl murakkab, compounded ignorance. He's ignorant, and he's ignorant that he's ignorant. Subhanallah. So anyway, so as you can imagine, this is very debilitating. It's a severe disability because in terms of functioning, he's not able to do employment, gainful work, even building friends. In fact, he's not able to do anything new. So basically his wife became his full-time carer. So it turned out in his life, I think after a couple of years after the infection, he moved to a new place, as in where he lived. And that was a big challenge for him because, as you can imagine, new home, he's not able to learn this layout. So essentially he's in a new home perpetually, new area. So essentially his wife had to become his full-time worker. So every morning they'll go for their morning walks, she would make him breakfast and whatnot. She tried to do what they could. I'll try and get to the point quickly. So one day, and this is the breakthrough they made with Eugene when it comes to the idea of habits. She heard a noise at the door, and she's like, Eugene, who's at the door? Actually trying to get ready. Eugene didn't reply, but she was busy getting herself ready. Now she's ready to go out for the morning walk. She said, Eugene, come, let's go. Where's Eugene? My man's gone. He's gone for his morning walk. So she's looking around and said, where's Eugene? Where's Eugene? She went outside. She realized he's gone. That noise was him leaving. So she's panicking. If he's left, that's it. He's out in the street. He has no way of knowing how to get home. So she's run up the road, down the road, screaming, Eugene, Eugene, can't find Eugene. She calls the police, tries to tell the police this was happening and whatnot. And then as she's on the phone talking to the police, Eugene walks in the front door, sits down in front of the TV and starts watching TV. So she finishes the call with the police and tells them, okay, he's back and thanks you, whatever. And she says to him, Eugene, where have you been? And he goes, I've been here all the time, what do you mean? He doesn't even remember that he went out. So the psychologist went, because he had a carer looking after him, they wanted to analyze what happened. How was he able to leave home, be gone for a while, and then find his way back home, when we know that he's unable to find long-term memories? And this was the breakthrough, which is very important for everyone to realize as part of this lecture. They discovered that there's a distinct difference in the brain between long-term memory and habits. Although he was unable to consciously remember anything long-term, he still was able to build habits. So every morning she was walking with her husband, the same route every single time, he was unconsciously building a habit of where to walk. So when he left his home, if you can imagine, let's go through the mindset of Eugene for that moment. He closed the door, went down the stairs, went to the street. So he looked around, he looked left, he looked right, and he's thinking, where should I go? So he made a decision to take a left or take a right on a conscious level. But what was really happening is that he was leaning towards habitual. He normally goes left, so his nafs favored the left. Went to the end of the road, came to a junction. Where should I go? Should I go left? Should I go right? I don't think I'll go right this time. He's thinking he's making a conscious decision, but he's actually working on habit. And this is what opened up the floodgates as to the impact and the significance of habits with the human mind. And if you just think for a second about that when it comes to Ramadan, what are we trying to do? We're trying to build that habit of righteousness, of goodness, so that when we come to events in our lives and we make decisions, should we go left, should we go right, should we choose the halal, should we choose the haram? We want to be the kind of person, we think that we're going to choose the halal because we're thinking that we are conscious beings, that we make these decisions consciously. But realistically, human beings, Muslim and non-Muslim, 95% of the time we are working on habits.
So so if what we can see from this example then is like, if we do something as a habit, it becomes a habit of ours. Obviously, we're talking about good things here. Then, when we are faced with different situations, we should switch automatically back to that good habit we've had.
Yes.
So if our good habits are in in relation to acts of worship or Islamic practices or actions, then we should turn to them as a default rather than.
Yeah. So let's look at some of the source, some of the text that would help us understand this. And one hadith came to mind when I think about these situations. خياركم في الجاهلية خياركم في الإسلام إذا فقهوا. The best of you before Islam will be the best of you after Islam if you have fiqh of the religion. Why is that though? Why would being good before Islam make you be a better person overall in terms of society as a whole, as a collective after Islam? If we're to believe and we're to say that Islam makes you a good person, why would what you was before change that or impact or even elevate that? Because there's less for you to change. Habitually, you're already in line with Islam, the Sharia. So think about it. A person before Islam, they had bad habits. They might smoke, they might drink, they might do all sorts of sin. And you have person B. He doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink, he doesn't do any of that kind of sin. Yeah, he's still a non-Muslim, but he doesn't do all that kind of thing. Both these, A and B, have taken the Shahada. A has to stop the drinking, stop the smoking, stop all the sins. B has to also stop sins, but he has less to stop. He has less to make change. So if both of them have fiqh, meaning have understanding of the religion, they have the knowledge. This is the key part. They have both have the keys to righteousness, but one of them is easier to turn those keys because there's less keys to turn, you could almost say. As in, one has to turn 1,000,000 keys every day to make himself a good person, whereas person B only has to turn maybe 5 or 2 because everything else is pretty much in line. Let me give an example of my own self. It's not usually a good example to do that, but this case is not so bad. Before I became Muslim when I was about 17, 18. But when I was 14, 13 in secondary school, my mum used to give me, obviously, money to buy lunch at secondary school. You do buy lunch or whatnot. And I had a wise idea. Let me just save that money, because there's money coming in, just fast for the day. And I can save up and buy my toys and whatnot, buy my clothes and whatnot. So I had, for many years, got used to the idea of being hungry, to the point where it became normal. So when I became Muslim and it was time for Ramadan, because I took Shahada in September, and that time Ramadan was about January, so it was pretty soon after becoming Muslim, Ramadan came. And everyone was like saying, oh, it's so difficult, I'm like, not really. it's not that bad. I mean, and I've come across many non-Muslims who, as soon as Ramadan comes, it's like the world is upside down. Oh, how can you not eat for 12 hours? And I'm like, it's not difficult. I mean, you do eat, you eat before, you eat after. You just have just wait in it. Because it wasn't difficult for me. I already had the habit. I already had trained myself to fast.
Can I hold you on that point because it's time to go for a break?
Yeah.
Join us, inshallah, after this short break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Now, just before the break, you talked about that story how you were saving your school money so that you were so you could use it for other things. But basically, that created a habit in you where staying hungry for a few hours. So you found that easy when it came to Ramadan because you'd already built that up a habit before Islam of going through a period of every day where maybe you're not eating for quite some time. Yeah.
So literally, after having breakfast, I would not be eating until I come up from school. And that was by choice. So and this is where I've always said to people, I've been very strict. And I guess it's interesting how the things that we're very strict on usually influenced by our own personal leanings. Always very strict, and people are saying that when it comes to raising children, make sure you give your child that life of Islam early on, as early as possible. And I always say the age of tamyiz, the age of you're beginning to become aware, which is the age of like 7 years old. Or I usually say to people, when their 2 front teeth have fallen out, that's usually the time of tamyiz, where they start to be aware of things. So they begin to become aware. Their good deeds are now begin to be written down, not their bad deeds, but their good deeds. By the age of puberty, Bullock is now where their bad deeds have been recorded and everything is started for them. So with that transition, that period of time, they have enough time as in their life to get used to being a Muslim. So before the age of tamyiz, your child may join you in salah, may not join you in salah, and you let them do what they need to do. And often they might want to do it just to emulate their parents. But when it comes to being the age of tamyiz, your child should definitely now start building these habits. So people, when parents ask me, when should I tell my child to pray? When should they start wearing hijab? When should they start fasting Ramadan? I always say the age of 7. Why? So they build these habits, so when it comes time that it's mandatory, it's nothing new. And sometimes, especially in the UK, sometimes when parents delay this until when it's mandatory, they struggle with their child because it's something so absent and so foreign to them that it's almost like, oh, I've been told what to do and I don't want to do it. It's so new and foreign to them. They haven't built these habits. And these are the things that they should have from as early as possible. So that just literally the transition is smooth. So back to the issue of habits. One of the things that I learnt, so also back to the issue of Eugene sparked a whole discussion, the scope of habits, the depth of habits, how habits are formed, what triggers habits, and this opened up a whole avenue in psychology, which we as Muslims can look at this and see how does Islam literally seems to already implement most of this already. 1,400 years before, we would find the same thing already applied. So one of the things which is interesting about what they discovered as they were analyzing habits is the idea of triggers. How do habits function? I mean, when we say there's a habit, what does that mean? What does it mean to have a habit? What happens in the mind is that we, human beings, react to impulses or information stimulus. What we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste. And these sensory input into our brains are like switches. They lead onto, there's like a cascading effect, it's like a domino. One domino falls and then others fall. And we form pathways of habits. So you might find, for example, one example that actually they did in their studies is what they did with I know it's a bad example, we're not dogs, but they did it with a dog, whereby they rang a bell every time they want to feed the dog. So what they discovered, after a while, the dog would begin to salivate just by the ringing of the bell. So every time the dog would hear the ring, his mind is already triggered, it's food. So this idea of anchors, they call it an anchor. An anchor is something that weighs something down. So anchors are triggers in our environment that weigh down and lead onto other actions. So let's have another example of that in Islam. What is the adhan? Adhan is a trigger. If every time you hear Allahu Akbar, you drop what you do, you make your wudu, make your way to the masjid and you pray 5 times a day, you're essentially reacting. Number one, you're building habits, and number 2, you're reacting to habits. It's a trigger. And that's why I'm saying that every part of Islam is essentially feeding and building these habits. The adhan is one of those things. Adhkar. What is adhkar? We are saying something with our tongues that's acting as a trigger internally, remembering Allah. Think about it. What's the connection between saying something? How does the words affect? We are triggering the remembrance of Allah, abstaining from sins.
That's well. I mean, like you mentioned Azkar. It reminds me that sometimes, like, I don't like to give an example of myself, but I tend to do the Azkar al-Sabah. It depends if I stay awake after Fajr or try and get a little bit more of an hour's sleep afterwards. But maybe I start off, but I find a lot of the time, I'm doing it in the car on the way into work.
Yeah.
So now, it becomes almost like a habit, without me realizing subconsciously is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Is when I get in the car in the morning, I turn the car on, the
dhikr comes out.
It starts to go because it's become a habit.
Yeah.
And I mean, and this is, which I'm sure we can elaborate on anyway, but just coming to my mind now, And this is what Ramadan does. I mean, I believe that also that there's some kind of study or saying that a habit, to become a habit, takes around, I don't know, 30, 40 days or something. So you can see that in Ramadan, we are doing these things that maybe we didn't do outside of Ramadan. So this should be becoming naturally for us. And I think that's why you find some people after Ramadan, they do kind of, at least for the first few days, they kind of unfortunately have to forcefully
Come out of the habits.
come out of the habit. It's not like all of a sudden they wake up on Eid and they don't want to read Quran anymore, they don't want to go to the masjid 5 times. Well, maybe they do. It depends what kind of Ramadan they had, you know. If they had one of those Ramadans where they weren't praying in Ramadan anyway,
Yeah.
then that's a different story altogether. But the ones who are trying to make an effort and they got into some good habits, it's highly unlikely that within a couple of days those habits are gone. They're literally going to have to kind of force their way back into the pre-Ramadan habits.
Yeah. So what you mentioned is, again, I was going to actually mention that that's one of the studies that they found is about how long it takes to form a habit. It's between 30 to 40 days. So if you again, we have the month of Ramadan of righteousness, of fasting, of Qiyamul Layl, and so on and so forth. This is literally our opportunity to reset. And this is why, if you think about some of the things that, you know, it mentions, خَيْرُ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ, you're the best of mankind, or a best nation has come out to the people. If you think about this on a practical level, what would make, other than Allah's decreeing that we be the greatest ummah, and Allah given us the Sharia, which would allow us to be the greatest ummah, what can we potentially point at as being the mechanisms that would lead us to be the greatest of ummah? And I think one of them, no doubtably, has to be Ramadan, because literally we have a whole month, a period in our life, on a yearly basis, which allows us to almost reset from, as in we will transgress, as Muslims, as human beings, we will go further and further away from righteousness by our environment, you know, the corruptions of our environment, what we see, what we hear. But we have a reset button, come back, and then we might drift again and then come back. Whereas if you look at other other nations, they don't have this reset whereby they have a period of time to bring you back. So basically, you can almost say that they can drift off into the wilderness, whereas as Muslims, we continuously get pushed back into line. Not just with Ramadan though, even the Salah. 5 times a day, our minds would drift, and then we, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, there's a call to the Salam, the Adhan. There's so much things in, I mean, even the name, dhikr, is a reminder us come back to righteousness. It's almost, Islam is telling you, Islam itself is the anchor, it is the reminder to come back to righteousness, because human beings naturally need that constant anchor.
I mean, talking about this whole habits and habitual thing, I mean, it reminds me of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he mentioned that Allah loves those deeds that are consistent, even if they are small. So this is, you know, indirectly talking about a habit. What does consistency mean? It means you're doing certain acts on a constant basis. You're doing those similar acts, but you're doing them regularly, so they're becoming like a habit. Of course, the most important thing is you have the intention. Obviously, we're not denying that it just becomes like a custom where there's no ikhlas, there's no khushu', it's just, obviously not. But the fact is that this is, you know, indirectly pointing to get into these good habits.
I think there's a word, because it's good you mentioned that hadith. I was actually going to mention it myself, but you mentioned it, got there before me, alhamdulillah. But there's one word just mentioned there about ikhlas. And I think us as Muslims, we seem to have this impression that to be sincere with our worship, we have to consciously, mechanically choose every mode and every action. And I don't think that's correct necessarily. And it makes me what I mean. As in, like you mentioned, you get into the car, instantly you do your dhikr. And some may say, "Oh, it's become a habit now. I'm not really thinking about it." And you must sometimes might even think, "Okay, it's not as sincere because it's just something you do." But maybe that's actually the opposite. You're saying it because it's become a part of you. It's actually who you are now. It's become your being, as opposed to something which you are literally forcing the hand to move here and move here. It makes sense. And it reminds me of a narration of one of the Sahaba who said, "Jahadtu nafsi 40 sana." I made jihad. I I struggled with my own nafs. I struggled with myself 40 years until I found the ladha, I found the sweet taste of ibadah. I mean, when you think about that, when I first heard that saying, I remember thinking to myself, what was it, a struggle for you? I mean, it was just something you come across in your mind, but it's not what he's saying. He's not saying it was a struggle for him. It was saying that it became his inner being. It became who he is. As in, there are things we all love to do as human beings. Some people love to read, some people love skiing. People have things they love to do as who they are. I mean, even me, before I became Muslim, I loved physics, I loved mathematics, I loved the whole science thing. I became Muslim, I was into I left that. I was Islam, Ibadah, I wanted talab al-ilm. But ironically, after I think 5 years, I was in Medina University, I started to think to myself, what's happened in the science community? What's happened recently? I started to move back to my tabi'ah, my normality, my nafs, how I normally am. And often you find people who, when they become Muslim, I think every revert might know this, might attest to this, that when they become Muslim, they have this zeal. They want to do everything, they want to do everything perfectly, as the norm. And I always told new Muslims, Alhamdulillah, that's great, keep that as much as long as possible, but that you are going to drift back to your norm. So try and make sure you find that stability within Islam. As in whatever you normally do, find that in Islam, and so you become stable in that because it is part of your being. So back to that companion, not companion, back to that one of the Salaf, the scholar of the Salaf. This 40 years of struggling in his nafs, what does it mean? It means that in that whole period of time, you can almost say that every part of his being was ibadah. As in, when you open the door, when you Bismillah, when you open the door, the adhkar you do when you're leaving the toilet or going to the toilet, it was him now. He couldn't even imagine not being that. And I remember saying to my wife the other day, as a little joke, I said, SubhanAllah, I just realized I've been Muslim longer than I wasn't.
Yeah.
And that's actually an interesting turning point for me, because it's like for a long period of time, I was a Muslim for a short period of my life. And then it dawned on me, actually, most of my life I've been Muslim. Although I became Muslim in my teens, in my late teens, I'm now 40, most of my life I've been Muslim. And the irony is, I can't even imagine life not being Muslim anymore.
That's exactly, I had a very similar thing only a short period ago, because I became Muslim when I was 14.
MashaAllah.
So now I'm 45. So I've been Muslim for 31 years.
MashaAllah.
And, and how many of those was I, depending on where you go and when it comes to that, but how many years was I really not a Muslim, if you really think about it?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, but the issue is the psychology. That's what I'm saying. It's anyone who's lived a life of not going to Islam, even if you're born in a Muslim family, you find it ironic. I don't believe this thing about, I'm born Muslim, you had advantage, you became Muslim. I think everyone makes a decision to follow Islam. Even if you're born in a Muslim family and you're surrounded by the environment of Islam, you still make a decision. At some point, I'm going to follow this Islam. But this decision, it takes time for that life to seep into your psyche and to be who you are. So therefore, you can no longer imagine life other than that. But back to the issue of Ramadan, because the whole point about Ramadan is that Ramadan gives us this period of time to deepen this connection to Islam, deepen our connection to Allah, so that hopefully we continue this after. And if you think about it as well, just to draw that parallel between the science and Islam, I remember I said 30 to 40 days.
Before we do that parallel, we're going to go for a break.
Okay.
So we continue, inshallah, after this short break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Now, right before the break, you're about to give us a parallel.
The cliffhanger.
The cliffhanger, yeah. And then along came the break.
Alhamdulillah. So as we know, the science tells us that it takes about 30 to 40 days to form habits or change habits. And that could be, it's not just the issue of forming good habits or new habits. It can also be stop an old habit, like biting nails or picking noses or whatever bad habits you may do. If you wanted to stop that, it takes about a time to stop that. So Islam gives us the 30 days that are whole Ramadan. So that's the perfect time period to get that habit started. But also, Islam encourages us to follow it up with Sittim min Shawwal, to follow it up with 6 extra days of Shawwal. What's the virtue of that? If you want to excel as a Muslim, just continue what you were doing for 6 more days. And as you know, the reward is like a fast in the whole year. And it was Shaykh Fawzan, rahimahullah, he mentioned that one of the benefits, or how to understand that, is that if every deed is multiplied by 10, so 6 days of 30 days of Ramadan is 300 days, that 6 days multiplied by 10 gives you 60. That gives you the length of time of a whole year. So we literally get 360 days, which is the length of time of the day, which helps us understand what is meant by finishing the 6 days of Shawwal being equivalent to fasting the year, because you've completed essentially fasting the whole year. But back to the point, you're reinforcing this habits, you're maintaining these habits, especially after a day of breaking that habit. So you've had a moment where you broke that habit, you ate and you enjoyed it with your family or whatnot, but then you came back to the habit, you came back to what you were normally doing, which will hopefully continue what you were doing. And I always tell people, even throughout Ramadan, you go to masjid, you do qiyam al-layl with the imam and so on and so forth, there's no reason why you should stop that. And actually, ironically, one of the best Ramadans, not the best Ramadan, but one of the best Ramadans I actually had in my life was actually during lockdown, because that was the first time that as a family we did Qiyam al-Layl at home. And I think that's the same for a lot of people. Before, we don't want to miss out on Qiyam al-Layl, Ramadan, so we do something at home. Even if it's just like a few raka'at. But what it got us to do was to build the habit which was intended, to pray at home. We do pray in the masjid, which is almost like a community thing. We go there, masjid, we pray, we see all the the neighbours and whatnot. But to pray at home is different. That's something more. It's more likely you can maintain that after Ramadan, because it's in the same environment as your home. And as we know, there's an added virtue of doing your sunnah salah at home anyway. So it's encouraged in Islam to do your sunnahs at home, then pray in the masjid and do your other sunnahs again at home. Sometimes people do it at the masjid. They do all this stuff at the masjid, but it's important to do it at home as well. And again, I want to draw that benefit back to Islam again. What is the benefit of doing your salah and doing these things at home as well? As the hadith, don't turn your house into a graveyard. So we can attach our own anchors around the home. If you always pray, especially in a certain room in your house at a certain time, that means that if you walked into that room, your nafs, just like with Eugene, as he found his way around the neighborhood on his own, due to anchors around the neighborhood, if we anchor worship to all our parts of our home, we're more likely to do our ibadah in those areas. And that's why it's very important not to make your home a place whereby whenever we're in this home, all we remember to do is other than worship. If we make our home a place where we also do worship, that means when we enter our home, the first thing we do, ibadah. I mean, I'm sure every one of our listeners can attest to this. Every night, before you go to bed, or maybe after the Isha or whatever, you do your witr. And everyone can attest that when you did a travel, like you did safar, or you went to your friend's house or whatnot, and you might have forgotten to do witr. Why did you forget to do witr? Because that location didn't trigger the reaction of witr. There's so many things that we normally do that sometimes we forget. Why did you forget? Because the environment was different. Something moved us away from that. It didn't remind us of that action. That's why it's important. That's why it's important to always try our best to do our ibadah all the time and try and have a certain routine. So these are some of the fawaid and benefits that we can get from our friend Eugene. And as we learn about habits. So in summary, we can say things like anchors are very important. Triggers, Islamic triggers. Adhans, the adhan, for example, is a certain trigger. And that's why I always encourage Muslims who live in environments that don't have the adhan. I would say it would be important to at least have it on your phone to go off at a certain time. Yes, it's not the adhan, but we still need to benefit from the trigger. So at this certain time of the day, this is what we hear. And when we do hear that, our nafs is inclined to do acts of worship. Imagine, every time your phone has the adhan, you always do your salah. That means that after a period of time, your nafs, your actual being, will feel uncomfortable not praying. Why? Because the nafs, the soul, always feels uncomfortable about the anomaly, that which is unusual, that which is odd. And it feels at ease and at comfort at the normal, that which is regular. If you're regularly doing your salah on time, at the regular time, then you would naturally feel inclined to do so. Like the scholar of the Salaf who, for 40 years, that means after those 40 years, it became his being, whereby everything he did was in line with al-Islam. So the issue of triggers is important. Also, they learn about the period of time, how long it takes to build habits. So during the month of Ramadan, we should make sure that whatever we have done prior to us having the conversation this month of Ramadan, we try and keep it up until the very end, all the way to the end, and try and continue it after as much as possible. Continue after Ramadan as much as possible, so that imagine we did it all throughout Ramadan and all throughout Shawwal, maybe it will continue without even thinking about it. And I'd like to conclude on the hadith where Allah's Messenger ﷺ tells us that if a person does a good deed regularly, but they forget to do that good deed for whatever the reason, Allah writes it as if he had done that deed. Why? Because it's become his habit. And it's only due to the environment, Allah's qadr, it's an afu. He comes to think of it as a forgiveness. You're forgiven for whatever came and distracted you, because it's your habit. You have dalil, you have evidence. You would have done it if the circumstances would have been in that line, in line with that lifestyle, you could say, in terms of your dress, in terms of your behavior, in terms of your attitude, how you behave with your family. And I think one last point. I think it was, as I was mentioning with family, I want to try and give the last bit of benefit. Sometimes, I know it's a bit of distraction from Ramadan, but sometimes people will call me, they have marital problems, they're having just always arguing about certain things. And I always remind them, said, you know what, most likely the reason why you're arguing a lot is because you built a habit to argue. As in, and it's actually very important, sometimes maybe your husband or your wife does something that triggers you to get upset. And how do we know this? We look at Eugene again. Very important thing. They discovered that Eugene used to get upset every time he saw his daughter. Every time he saw his daughter, he used to get upset. And they tried to realize, why would he get upset? They discovered, after analyzing his lifestyle, that the reason why is that every time his daughter would you come visit, spend time with him, and when she was leaving, she said, oh, I'm going to go, Dad, now, bye-bye. He thought she just came and now she's leaving. So it became a trigger that when he saw her, he only remembered, the trigger was, I'm going to go now, Dad. So seeing his daughter became a trigger of upset. She's abandoning him, she's leaving him. So they had to change the way they interacted with him so that now, before she leaves, she has to spend some time with him first. So if she's going to leave like in the next 5-10 minutes, she first come, sit down with him, ask how he is, hold his hand, talk to him, whatnot. And then after that, say, I got to go now. So therefore they had to change that trigger. So therefore, that after being there for a couple of, I don't know how long it took, but he was no longer upset at seeing his daughter, because now, every time he saw his daughter, the habit was she would spend time with him. She would show love to him. And that now changed his persona, changed his attitude to now be nice with his daughter rather than being upset. But what's interesting is that it wasn't a conscious thing. It wasn't upset ever consciously. It was a subconscious thing. It was an unsaid thing. Likewise, amongst a spouse, maybe your wife does something that triggers you to be upset. Maybe a way to address that is to find good triggers in your family, even with your children, your employees, your people around you. If you find yourself agitated, being upset, one way to address that is to change your environment, change your triggers, and find good elements to your life. Be happy, always smile, say good words. And one thing I used to love when I used to live in Saudi Arabia about living in a Muslim environment is the dua, the dhikr. Always talking with someone, there's always a dhikr, there's always, even when they're arguing. I'm seeing people in the streets arguing, Hadakallah ya Sheikh. Even when they're arguing, making dua for someone. And this is one of the good things about the Muslim character is that in everything we do, it has to be in reflection on the glorification of Allah, whether it be dhikr, whether it be even salah. Even when the Sahaba came to Messenger of Allah, complaining of being angry, what did he say? Make wudu. So these are the things, if every time you get angry, you're making wudu, soon what would happen? Anger will become a trigger for ibadah. Think about that. Every time you get angry, you do active worship. That would mean that over time, being angry will make an abid, to make you worshipper of Allah. This is one of the benefits of understanding how habits work, how the psychology works, how the mind works. And hopefully that can help us take maximum benefit from Ramadan.
We have a couple of minutes left, but I mean, just to end, what are some of those habits? I know there's been so many. If you could name like 4 or 5 habits now that Muslims should definitely start to do in Ramadan, if they haven't already started doing that.
So definitely, one of the things that I would say that one should maximize their benefit from Ramadan is the salah. And I don't mean just praying, because obviously you have to pray, obviously, but I mean being strict with the salah. Hence why I mentioned about the issue of the adhan. So it's very easy to come into the habit that when you hear the adhan, you say, okay, I've got time to pray. And some of us may even wait to the iqamah before you make any move. This time round, we should be making our moves at the hearing of the adhan. At the moment when it's time to pray, we should stop what we're doing. Why? So that the adhan itself will be the trigger to ibadah, and it won't become an afterthought. If you continuously delay your salah until the last minute, that will become your habit, that will become your trigger. Adhkar throughout the day, specifically in terms of our mundane, adhkar in the mundane, I would say, opening the door, closing the door, leaving your home, entering into a building. These things weave Islam within your everyday activities, so that it actually becomes what you normally do.
I think we've come to the end of the show. Jazakallah khair for all the advice.
Jazakallah khair.
And also for the viewers, have a good idea on how important habits are. Let's make a change in our habits. Inshallah, start the good ones and leave the bad ones. And inshallah, till next time, I leave you as always the greetings of Islam, the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.